Support provided by Walters Papillon Thomas Cullins, LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.
But anyway, thank you. It is a great honor to be here today at Baton Rouge Rotary. It's actually been, I guess, I'm not sure the number of years, but the last time I spoke to this group, you guys were still over at Boudreaux's. And so I'm very honored to be back here again. Let me tell you, what is it that the Inspector General does? Well, Tommy touched on it briefly. We investigate fraud and public corruption involving government, essentially. And that's been the job that I've done now for 11 years. And I can tell you that having been the Inspector General for 11 plus years in the state of Louisiana, that is to the joy of some and to the dismay of others, depending on who you talk to. I'm either the greatest thing since sliced bread or the worst SOB that ever lived, depending on who you talk to. We have limited time today, so what I want to do is to give you the 40,000-foot view of what it means to be a fraud and corruption investigator in the state of Louisiana. And I want to start by sharing a little anecdote with you. One of the main things that I've learned over a 30-year legal career, which has all been in criminal justice, is that things are not always as they seem. I'll repeat that for you. Things are not always as they seem. So let's just talk a little bit. Suppose you're going to the Spanish Town Mardi Gras parade. And of course, everybody's having a great time at the parade, imbibing plenty of spirits, as we are known for here in Louisiana. The parade's over, everybody's heading home for the day. As you're walking to where you parked your car, because most people have to walk a good ways on a parade route, right? As you're walking to where you parked your car, you see a Suburban parked on the road, a nice one, a BMW Suburban, one that's kind of up off the ground. And you notice that there's a young man there, and that young man is walking around that car, pulling on every door handle. And then as you take a little bit closer look, you can see that the way that he's dressed just makes him look maybe like he's not up to any good, right? He's got the sort of the gangbanger look, right? And he's walking around that car, and then all of a sudden you see him lean down and pick up a concrete chunk off of the road and throw that piece of concrete through the window of that Suburban. Reach in, undo the lock, open the door, and begin to get in the car. Now, what are your first impressions of what you just saw? That guy's up to no good. He's a thief, he's a burglar, he's a guy that's going to steal whatever he can inside that vehicle or steal the vehicle itself. But whatever it is, he's up to no good, right? Now let me add a couple of facts for you. I've already mentioned to you that this vehicle's pretty high up off the ground, and I'll even add another fact for you. The windows are tinted. And you can't see below the level of the hood in terms of what is inside that car. But what if I add the fact for you that inside that car is a child strapped into a child safety seat, and that child is turning blue, about to choke to death. Now, I added facts for you that your eyes could not see, but that just completely changed your perception of what your eyes did see. Does that make sense to everyone? As I say sometimes to law enforcement, when I get to teach at post academies sometimes, and I say, are we tracking? That, in a nutshell, is the investigation business if you do it right. The investigation business is based upon getting to the truth, whatever it is, and to do that, you must start with the notion that things are not always as they seem on the surface. So, what happens when you look beneath the surface here in Louisiana? And I appreciate my good friend Tommy, noting the irony of a Louisiana Inspector General being made president of this national and international group for the past several years. And so the question is, what happens when you look beneath the surface here in Louisiana? Is our public corruption here worse than other places around the country or around the world? My experience is, who said yes? Somebody said yes? There you go. All right, well, I will, and I totally understand that why people would feel that way. But I'm going to tell you that it's not worse. It's just that for many decades or even centuries in this state, we were way prouder of our public corruption than everybody else. It's a true story. Corruption exists everywhere that there are human beings, money, power, and the opportunity to do the wrong thing. It's human nature. It exists everywhere, believe me. One of my favorite activities is when I teach for the National Institutes or I go to whatever state it is. I mean, I've been up to Illinois, and believe you me, they can give us a run for our money. They've had 4 governors go to jail. We've only had 2 that I know of. Maybe you could say there were more that should have gone to jail, but that's a whole separate debate, right? So the fact is that what I usually do is I will pull the class rosters of these when I'm getting ready to give these talks, and I will ask the question that I just did. And almost everybody in the room thinks that Louisiana is, got this banana republic thing going on. And look, that's a well-earned reputation. I'll be the first to admit it. But then what I do is go through the history of the corruption in their states, and it usually tends to slow down the train just a little bit. In my 11 plus years in this job, I've gained some things. Probably the first thing would be several new layers of thick alligator hide, because I'm going to tell you, this job is, if you're going to do it right, you've got to be able to withstand all sorts of withering criticism sometimes and attacks. But one of the things that I've learned is that it is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. That's a quote from Abraham Lincoln, which I keep in my office on my wall. It's sort of a thing to remind me to think before you speak. And the other thing is that you only have credibility once. Once you lose your credibility, it's almost impossible to get it back. So take a look at the screen and you can see what I'm talking about. It'll work. Oh, well, the video's not working, but I may have to describe it to you.
Press the button again.
Okay, let's try it one more time. Go backwards. Well, we'll try this one. See if this one works. You only have credibility once. Now, I don't know that requires much further explanation. That fits in with the things aren't always as they seem theme, right? Now, another thing that I've learned as Inspector General in 11 plus years is to never argue with a fool, because onlookers will not be able to tell the difference. Okay, that's actually a quote by Mark Twain. Now let's talk about, what do I mean when I talk about arguing with a fool? Because that word can be thrown around very loosely sometimes. What does a fool, in my view, a fool is somebody who's often wrong but never in doubt. You know anybody like that? I'll tell you, I've dealt with some of them, because in this day and age, all you need is a keyboard in your mom's basement, and you can basically become a quote-unquote political blogger or journalist. And you operate with zero standards and zero duty to get anything right, or zero duty to the truth. So don't argue with those people, because onlookers won't be able to tell the difference. And I want to give you a story that's from my career that I think illustrates this pretty well. And let me back up for you a few years, just for those of you who may not be familiar with this. I was appointed by Governor Bobby Jindal. He's the one who gave me the opportunity to become the Inspector General. And as you know, especially in his second term, he made no secret of the fact that he wanted to become the President of the United States, and was actually had a campaign that was up and running. Well, one day I actually get a complaint on my desk that public resources are being used to support this campaign for president. And I mean, I get all sorts of complaints, but so I started to take a look at it. And to get more specific, the complaint was that the governor had used allowed his staff to use the public website for the governor's office that's taxpayer funded to issue a statement that criticized Rand Paul for something about the Iraq war or something concerning a policy on Iraq. And so my job was to actually look at that situation according to the law and the facts. My job is very straightforward. It is to get to the truth, whatever it is, compare it with the law, and figure out what happens next. That's my job in a nutshell. So we took a very close look at that situation and determined that while the look of it wasn't good, it was clearly a mistake, which I think they acknowledged. There was no criminal consequence to it, nor did it actually violate the law, because the law contained a specific exception for the candidates that were running for president. And so I didn't write the law, but I applied the law. I issued a statement, or actually a detailed report to that effect. Well, and of course that got a ton of attention, as you might imagine. Well, the next morning in my inbox is an email, and I'm just going to read it to you verbatim. This will give you an idea of the type of stuff that sometimes comes my way. Dear Mr. IG, I read your opinion regarding the governor's press release commenting on Senator Rand Paul. I don't know what are the qualifications for the Inspector General in the state of Louisiana, but I have to assume that you went to dancing school. I served 16 years in the Louisiana legislature and have seen some pretty fancy dancing, and you are up there right in the top tier, sir. You know there will be life after Bobby Jindal, so try to do your job the right way and you will sleep better at night. It might even help you in the future. And sincerely, obviously for obvious reasons, I'm not going to identify who sent that. But I recognize the name. And I'll tell you how I recognize the name, because I was involved in a big racketeering trial just a few years before I became the IG, and I remembered this fellow as one of the unindicted co-conspirators in that case. That is an absolutely 100% true story. And so I sat down at the keyboard and, kind of decided, let me see if I can reply here. Dear sir, thanks for your email. I have never been to dancing school, though my wife would be thrilled if I decided to go. I also sleep well most nights, but do occasionally get a crick in the neck. I really appreciate your concern for my future as Inspector General. It means a lot to me, having spent most of my nearly 30-year legal career defending, prosecuting, and now investigating criminal public corruption cases. Although we have never met, I'm familiar with your career in the Louisiana legislature. In 1997, I was one of the defense lawyers in the video poker racketeering trial in New Orleans. Should I ever need dancing lessons, I will be sure to give you a call. Thanks again for writing. Now, how many of you think that I sent that? Okay, that was one of those therapeutic kind of, let's write it, let's get it out of your system, and then move on to the next thing. Why? Because never argue with a fool, because onlookers won't be able to tell the difference. I have learned this. What else have I learned as the Inspector General? You have enemies? Good. That means that you stood up for something sometime in your life. Winston Churchill said that. In this job, sometimes you're required to take a stand that's very unpopular, and you catch a lot of grief over it. But you have to be able to look in the mirror. You've got to be able to know that you did your job according to the law and the facts and nothing else. And in this day and age, all you have to do is flip on the television to see the opposite of that happening on an almost daily basis. Telling half the story is often much worse than telling a straight-up lie. Why? Because it's fundamentally dishonest. And there are sometimes just reckless. Here's another thing I've learned at the Inspector General, or as Inspector General. If you strike the king, you must kill him. That was what Ralph Waldo Emerson said. And let me just be frank with you. What it means is you don't take a half-cocked swing at a high-profile target without having your case wired tight. Okay, that's we call it the evidence business. Inspectors general or fraud and corruption investigators are in the evidence business, period. By far, the most criticism that I've received as Inspector General in my 11 years has been those times where I concluded that the evidence did not support criminal charges against high-profile public officials. Most of the people criticizing you either do not understand the evidence business or do not care to. If it doesn't fit their preferred narrative, sometimes there's just no meeting of the minds there. Because part of my job for many years was to actually be a lead prosecutor in serious public corruption cases, and I've been involved in the, as Tommy said, the capital murder variety cases as well. The evidence business it's not just an important thing, it's really the only thing. So what does it mean to be in the evidence business? Well, you evaluate the credibility of witnesses. You do not accept what they tell you at face value. You test what they're saying against other evidence. Do they have motive to lie? If someone comes in and tells you breathlessly that the moon is made of green cheese, you have two choices. You can run it in a 6-inch headline, or you can check it out. On the wall of the Chicago Tribune for many years, and may still be there, the sign that says, if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. Okay, now here's the deal. That standard has pretty much gone out the window, unfortunately. And why do we say this? Well, you know, have you ever heard that when you see a turtle on top of a fence post, what does that tell you? Someone put it there. But you don't know who put it there. You don't know when they put it there. You don't know why they put it there. You don't know any of the background as to how that turtle ended up there. You can just say, well, you know initially that someone put it there. It didn't crawl up there by itself. So the evidence business requires work. Do you know what we call opinion in the absence of evidence? That's called prejudice. That's called prejudice. And we do everything we can to try to avoid that. But we have witnessed terrible tragedies that have occurred over the years. Do you remember Richard Jewell, the fellow who was falsely accused of the Atlanta Olympic Park bombing? Or how about the Duke lacrosse case, very infamous? Or the University of Virginia gang rape story that was completely found to be false. Rolling Stone completely retracted that story, and now that whole thing is tied up in civil litigation. What are the other things that I've learned? What are the best qualities of a good inspector general? And I've gotten to know many of them around the country and some from around the world. The best inspectors general are aggressive. They do whatever they have to get to the truth within the bounds of ethics and the law. The best IGs are purely objective. They've got no dog in the hunt other than finding the truth. The best IGs are courageous. They're willing to stand alone for what is right if necessary. The best IGs are fair. And the last point I want to make to you is that the best IGs, and this applies across the board to anybody that's involved in criminal investigation, the best of those do their work behind the scenes, quietly and professionally. Just because you don't read about something in the paper doesn't mean that it's not happening. And I would encourage everybody in this room that when you hear stories that involve leaks from an internal audit or an internal investigation, when you get leaks, you need to treat those very skeptically, because sometimes the motives for leaking those things have nothing to do with the truth. They have to do with an agenda. So what happens when you do the job right? Any job in public service, if you do it right, you're going to be attacked for it eventually. My office, we don't have enough time to discuss it today, but there have been 2 different efforts in my 11 years to completely close down the IG down at the legislature. Both of those were unsuccessful. There are different kinds of, sometimes you see articles popping up, again, as I discussed amongst the bloggers and things like that. But I go back to what Abraham Lincoln said, who's probably the most vilified president in American history, even more so than the current one that's in office, if that's even possible to imagine. But if I were to try to read, much less answer, all the attacks made on me, this shop might as well be closed for any other business. I do the very best I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep doing so until the end. If the end brings me out all right, what's said against me won't amount to anything. If the end brings me out wrong, then 10 angels swearing that I was right would make no difference. So that is essentially the creed that I've chosen to live by over the last 11 years. And so what happens when I'm allowed to do the job right? Well, let me give you two quick examples and maybe throw it open for one or two questions. One of the things that we were able to affect some pretty broad change in was the Louisiana's film tax credit program. And how did that happen? We worked a variety of significant criminal fraud cases involving that program where people flatly stole money from the state of Louisiana, millions and millions of dollars. And I'll just read them off for you. United States versus Walker, United States versus Kostic, United States versus Keefe, United States versus Garcia, United States versus Peter Hoffman, United States versus Susan Hoffman, United States versus Michael Arata, Horizon Entertainment. The total fraud on those cases was $11 million. The OIG annual budget is less than $2 million. And these are cases where people actually were sentenced to prison time and required to pay criminal orders of restitution. And a lot of those cases, one or two of them are still in the pipeline. One is about to go up to the United States Supreme Court on a cert application, but we think that there's almost no chance of success on that. But one of the results of all of those cases coming forward was that the legislature decided to reform that particular program. And one of the things they did was put a $180 million cap on it that was first come, first served. They changed it to where now the auditors represent the state rather than the applicant for the tax credits. And now we get pretty much automatic referrals from economic development on anything that is suspicious. And very quickly, the types of fraud we saw were very, very blatant, just false expenses submitted to the state. Those of you who may not be familiar, the way those programs work is you spend money in accordance with the program guidelines, and then you get actual refundable tax credits up to 40% of what you spent on the project. And so we are, sometimes you have people just submitting flatly false expenses, and what they do is use computer online banking to do what we call circular transactions. You have 2 or 3 LLCs that you own, and you just move the same $20,000 around 200 times, and each time that amounts to a separate transaction, right? And on paper, it looks legit, but the minute you dig into it, you realize that it's fraud. So that, and there are many other cases. If you go to oig.louisiana.gov, you can look at the highlights of what we've done. But this is an office that has made significant headway in the last 11 years. It's been around for longer than that, but we finally do have the biggest single point is law enforcement power. And so that's allowed us to work with federal prosecutors, to work with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I actually have agents embedded with the Bureau that have helped us to work big fraud cases. And all I can tell you is stay tuned, because you're going to see the headlines in the next year are going to have quite a bit of the fruit, finally, of the work that we've done over the years. Quiet professionals, that's what I like to call us. We don't go chasing television cameras down the street. That's not the business we're in. Our business is to get to the truth, whatever it is, through competent, admissible evidence, measure that truth against the law, and then hold people accountable. And that's the job that we've been up to for the past 11 years. And again, you only have credibility once, and I hope to maintain that credibility for as long as I am in this job. So I think I have how much time? And 1 minute for questions. If anybody has a question, I'm glad to fire away. Yes, sir.
Do you have any interface with Louisiana Attorney Disciplinary Board or the Judges Disciplinary Group keeping track on attorneys?
We do, actually, and in fact, less so with the Judges Disciplinary Board, but because we don't have jurisdiction over the judicial branch. But there have been several cases where we've had lawyers that have stolen large quantities of funds from the Louisiana government and from the U.S. government. And we have worked with Charles Platzmeyer to make sure that those lawyers are held accountable to hopefully get their license suspended or revoked so that they can't use that law license to continue to steal from honest people. Yes, sir.
How big is your department, and where do you get your investigators?
Okay, the department, the question was, how big is our department and where do we get our investigators? The department has 16 people. I have 11 criminal investigators. They're post-certified, which means that they have law enforcement and they carry guns while they're on duty. All of my people, with maybe one exception, is retired law enforcement. They come from the state police, from the sheriff's office, from the DA's offices, and all over. I mean, I've got that, and that's what we want to try to find: seasoned law enforcement professionals that know what it means to prove a criminal case, rather than throw something against the wall and ruin somebody's reputation when you don't have the proof to back it up. Okay. Thank you guys very much. Oh, I got one more question in the back. I see somebody right there. That's a great question. Yes, we do work with the legislative auditor. We have partnered with them. In fact, we've actually been sued together. And you know, in our business, if you're not getting sued, you're not working. That's one of the phrases in the. But yes, we work with the auditor regularly. The main difference between us and the auditor is that we have the law enforcement designation. They don't, but they have very broad investigative powers and a lot of very great professional people that we're glad to work with. Thank you guys for having me. Really appreciate it.
Support provided by Walters Thomas Cullins LLC, specializing in business litigation and personal injury cases for over 40 years.